Two firefighters insulted and sprayed water on the mayor's wife and were eventually fired. It was a bright summer morning in the city, and the fire station was buzzing with its usual activity. Firefighters hurried in and out of the station, checking their gear, washing their trucks, and preparing for the day ahead. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with the faint smell of smoke and metal from the fire trucks. The station was alive, a small but important world where every firefighter had their role, and every second counted. Among the firefighters were Mark and Tony, two colleagues who had worked together for several years. Both were experienced in handling emergencies, but they were also known for their bold personalities and, at times, reckless sense of humor. They were the kind of firefighters who joked loudly, played pranks on each other, and sometimes tested the limits of their superiors' patience. Most of their colleagues liked them, even if they sometimes rolled their eyes at their antics. That morning, there was unusual news for the station. The mayor's wife, Evelyn, was coming for a visit. She was scheduled to inspect the firehouse as part of a city program to appreciate public servants. While the firefighters respected the mayor's office, they also felt nervous. Visitors of such high status rarely came to the station, and the thought of making a bad impression worried some. Mark and Tony, however, were more confident or perhaps more careless. They laughed among themselves, joking about how formal the mayor's wife would be, and teasing each other about what they would say if she criticized their work. Their jokes, though harmless among them, hinted at a lack of seriousness toward the upcoming visit. As the hour of Evelyn's arrival approached, the firefighters adjusted their uniforms, polished their boots, and made sure their station looked presentable. The trucks gleamed under the sunlight, and the hoses were neatly coiled. The atmosphere was a mix of pride, nervous energy, and curiosity. Some firefighters whispered about how important it was to be respectful and professional, while Mark and Tony continued to crack jokes. They joked about pretending to slide down the fire pole in slow motion or spraying her with a hose as part of a welcome demonstration. At first, the comments were light-hearted, and no one suspected they would actually act on them. When Evelyn arrived, she was dressed elegantly, projecting an air of authority but also a friendly demeanor. She walked into the station with a small group of aides and city officials. The firefighters stood at attention, ready to greet her properly. Evelyn smiled politely and shook hands with several of the men, observing the station with interest. She asked questions about the firefighters' daily routines, their training schedules, and their experiences during emergencies. Her questions were straightforward, but to Mark and Tony, they felt slightly critical. They interpreted her curiosity and careful observations as subtle judgment of their abilities. In reality, Evelyn had no intention of offending anyone. She was simply doing her duty, wanting to understand and appreciate the work of the firefighters. Mark and Tony exchanged glances. They felt a mix of nervousness, embarrassment, and, oddly, defiance. They didn't want to appear intimidated or small in front of her. As Evelyn moved closer to inspect the equipment, she casually commented on the polished fire trucks, noting how well maintained they were. Then, her attention turned to the men themselves. She asked, "Do you feel the training here fully prepares you for emergencies?" It was a simple question, meant to start a conversation. But to Mark and Tony, it sounded like an indirect critique, as if she were questioning their readiness. Their minds raced, and in a moment of impulsive judgment, they decided to respond with humor, though it would quickly cross the line. Mark whispered something to Tony, and both of them smiled mischievously. In their minds, it was a harmless joke, a way to lighten the tension and show that they were not intimidated by the mayor's wife. But what they didn't consider was how quickly a joke could turn into humiliation. Without thinking through the consequences, they grabbed the fire hose nearby. A few of their colleagues noticed, some with growing concern, but it was too late to intervene. In a sudden and impulsive act, they turned the hose toward Evelyn and sprayed her with a strong stream of water. The cold water hit her unexpectedly, soaking her clothes and making her hair cling to her face. Her aides gasped, stepping back in shock, while some firefighters froze, unable to believe what had just happened. The station fell silent for a moment, except for the sound of water splashing and the surprised gasps of those present. Evelyn, drenched and shocked, instinctively shielded herself and took a step backward. Her calm composure faltered for just a moment, replaced by visible anger and humiliation. The aides hurried to her side, offering towels and helping her regain her balance. She looked around, her eyes briefly meeting Mark and Tony's. In that instant, the gravity of the situation became clear to everyone. What had been meant as a joke by the two firefighters was perceived as a serious insult, a public act of disrespect directed at the mayor's wife. Even the colleagues who usually laughed at Mark and Tony's antics felt a sense of disbelief and shame. Mark and Tony, realizing the reaction, tried to laugh it off. They muttered something about just a joke and lightening the mood. But their words did nothing to calm the tension. The aides whispered to Evelyn, who nodded and took a deep breath to regain composure. The mayor had not yet arrived, but news of the incident would soon reach him. The two firefighters now faced more than just a shocked audience, they faced the looming consequences of a reckless decision. Other firefighters began to murmur among themselves, some criticizing the act, while others remained silent, unsure of how to respond. The firehouse, usually a place of controlled chaos and camaraderie, now felt heavy with tension and anticipation. As Evelyn continued her visit, though cautiously, the atmosphere had changed. Her questions became formal and controlled, her smile polite but distant. Mark and Tony, once confident and joking, now felt the weight of embarrassment. They realized that a moment of impulsive behavior had transformed into a serious incident that could affect their careers and reputations. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, silently acknowledging that what had happened was unacceptable. The fire chief, though not yet present, would be informed immediately, and the repercussions were inevitable. Later that day, as the news of the incident started to spread within city offices and social media, the reality of their actions began to sink in for Mark and Tony. They had crossed a line that could not easily be erased. What started as nervous humor and a momentary lapse in judgment had escalated into an event with real consequences. They sat quietly in the locker room, replaying the incident in their minds, realizing that respect, professionalism, and public trust were not matters to joke about. The firehouse, once a place of pride and teamwork, now served as a reminder of how quickly a single moment could change everything. By the end of the day, it was clear that this incident would not be forgotten. The mayor's office would demand accountability, the fire chief would investigate, and their reputations would be questioned by colleagues, the public, and the media. Mark and Tony faced not only immediate embarrassment but also the possibility of disciplinary action. The simple act of spraying water, done in a misguided attempt at humor, had sparked a chain of events that would affect their lives and careers. And so, what seemed like an ordinary summer day at the firehouse became the beginning of a story that would capture the attention of the entire city, a story of impulsive choices, public humiliation, and the consequences of forgetting that respect is essential, no matter how casual a situation may seem. The day after the incident, the fire station felt very different. Where there had usually been loud laughter, chatter, and friendly banter, now there was a quiet tension that hung heavily in the air. Firefighters went about their duties, but even the simplest tasks, checking the trucks, organizing equipment, cleaning hoses, felt different, as though the walls themselves were watching. Mark and Tony, once confident and brash, moved slowly and cautiously, aware that every glance from their colleagues carried judgment. They could feel the weight of the event pressing down on them, and the reality of what they had done began to settle like a stone in their stomachs. Outside the firehouse, the news had already started to spread. Local newspapers ran small but attention-grabbing stories about the incident. Social media lit up with posts and videos from witnesses, some showing blurred images of the water spraying, others describing the moment in words that made it sound even worse than it had been. People expressed shock and anger, calling the act disrespectful, unprofessional, and embarrassing to the city. The mayor's office did not wait long to issue a statement, calling the incident inappropriate and unacceptable, emphasizing the expectation of respect for public officials and their families. Within hours, the story had traveled from local news outlets to national attention, creating a storm of public opinion. Inside the station, whispers and uneasy glances were constant. Some firefighters approached Mark and Tony cautiously, offering advice or quietly reminding them of the potential consequences. Others were less sympathetic, expressing anger and disappointment that two experienced firefighters would act so recklessly. Even the veterans, who had seen more dangerous situations than most could imagine, shook their heads in disbelief. The camaraderie that had once defined the firehouse felt fragile, threatened by the reckless choices of two of its own. Mark and Tony began to realize that this was no longer just a personal mistake, it was a professional crisis, and the scrutiny would not stop until accountability was demanded. The fire chief called an emergency meeting that afternoon. All firefighters gathered in the main hall, standing silently as the chief entered, his face serious and unyielding. He began by reminding everyone of the responsibilities they carried as firefighters, not just the physical risks, but the public trust they were expected to uphold. Then he addressed the incident directly, describing the mayor's wife's visit and the actions that had taken place. He did not sugarcoat the seriousness of the situation. "This is not a joke," he said firmly. "This is a breach of trust and professionalism. It reflects poorly on all of us and cannot be ignored." Mark and Tony felt a tight knot in their stomachs. They could barely meet anyone's eyes as the chief continued to outline the steps that would follow. An official investigation would be launched immediately. Witnesses would be interviewed, video footage would be reviewed, and the findings would be forwarded to the city administration. The chief emphasized that the consequences could be severe, including suspension or even termination. There was no room for excuses. The words hung in the air like a warning, and every firefighter in the room understood that Mark and Tony had crossed a line that could not be undone. As the meeting ended, some firefighters walked away quietly, processing the news, while others lingered to offer cautious words to their colleagues. Some tried to defend Mark and Tony, suggesting that it had been a silly prank or a momentary lapse in judgment, but the majority acknowledged that the action had serious consequences. Even those who had once admired the two for their humor now recognized that boldness must be tempered with respect, especially when dealing with members of the public. The reality was clear: no joke, no matter how well-intentioned it might seem, could justify humiliating someone in such a public way. Meanwhile, Mark and Tony faced a different kind of stress outside the firehouse. Messages began to pour in from friends, family, and even distant acquaintances, all asking about the incident. Some were sympathetic, suggesting they had overreacted to a harmless joke, but others were harsh, criticizing their lack of judgment. Both men spent hours replaying the event in their minds, trying to understand how a moment that had seemed funny to them could escalate into a situation that threatened their careers. They realized that in the eyes of the public, and especially the mayor's office, this was no longer a minor mistake, it was a serious act of disrespect that demanded accountability. As the day continued, city officials prepared for the investigation. Witnesses, including firefighters and aides from the mayor's office, were asked to provide detailed accounts of the event. Statements were written, describing not only the act itself but also the atmosphere, the reactions, and the impact on Evelyn. Surveillance footage from the firehouse, which had captured the visit, was reviewed carefully. The video showed the moment clearly: Mark and Tony laughing as they sprayed water, Evelyn's shocked reaction, and the aides rushing to assist her. The evidence painted a picture of intentional behavior, not an accident, and made it clear that the act had been deliberate. Public reaction intensified as the investigation continued. Editorials in newspapers criticized the firefighters for acting childishly and recklessly, arguing that those entrusted with public safety should behave with integrity at all times. Social media posts spread widely, some defending the mayor's wife, others condemning Mark and Tony, and a few attempting to argue that it was just a joke gone wrong. The majority of comments, however, were overwhelmingly critical, with many users calling for serious consequences. In the firehouse, Mark and Tony could feel the pressure mounting. Every incoming phone call, every notification, reminded them that this was no longer just about embarrassment, it was about accountability and the real possibility of losing their jobs. Within the department, tension between firefighters grew. Some colleagues felt sympathy, acknowledging that mistakes happen, but others voiced strong disapproval, stressing the importance of maintaining professional standards. Group conversations became cautious, with firefighters choosing words carefully, mindful of the investigation. Rumors and speculation swirled, but the underlying reality was that the incident had changed the environment forever. Mark and Tony, once the center of humor and camaraderie, now felt isolated. Even casual gestures from colleagues seemed weighed down with judgment and caution. The social dynamic of the firehouse had shifted dramatically, a visible reminder that one impulsive act could alter relationships and reputations overnight. Meanwhile, Mark and Tony tried to prepare for the upcoming questioning from the chief and city officials. They discussed what they might say, debating whether to admit the act, claim it was a joke, or attempt to justify it in some other way. But deep down, both knew that no explanation could fully erase the impact of their actions. They were aware that respect, particularly toward public figures, was non-negotiable. They had failed to consider how their behavior would be perceived by the mayor, his aides, the public, and even their own colleagues. The realization was sobering, and for the first time, both men experienced a genuine sense of regret for their impulsive decision. Outside the firehouse, Evelyn began to speak privately with city officials about the incident. She was careful to maintain her dignity, expressing disappointment and emphasizing that such behavior was unacceptable. She requested a thorough investigation and accountability for those responsible. Her words were firm yet measured, reflecting her frustration while also upholding the standards expected of public figures. News outlets reported on her statements, further increasing public scrutiny. Mark and Tony, following the coverage online, felt a mixture of fear and shame as they read the comments and analyses from reporters, columnists, and citizens alike. By the end of the day, the situation had grown serious enough that the mayor himself was informed. His response was immediate and decisive: the incident would be investigated fully, and no leniency would be granted for behavior that disrespected his family and the city. Inside the firehouse, the atmosphere became tense and quiet as firefighters waited for the investigation to begin. Mark and Tony sat in the locker room, silent and reflective. The humor and bravado that had defined their personalities seemed distant, replaced by anxiety and remorse. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that one impulsive act could change their lives and careers in ways they had never imagined. The day closed with a lingering sense of unease. Mark and Tony had learned that public trust is fragile, that professional conduct is not optional, and that jokes, no matter how harmless they may seem to the perpetrator, can have serious consequences. The firehouse, once a place of routine and camaraderie, had become a lesson in accountability. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the polished trucks and coiled hoses, the two firefighters realized that they had crossed a line that could not be easily uncrossed. Their actions had set in motion a series of events that would be remembered by the city, their colleagues, and themselves for a long time. The following morning, the firehouse felt even quieter than before. Where there had once been the usual energy, a sense of tension and uncertainty now lingered in every corner. Firefighters moved carefully through the station, checking equipment and completing routines in silence. The usual jokes and laughter were gone. Everyone knew that the incident with the mayor's wife had changed things, and no one could predict the consequences. Mark and Tony arrived early, aware that the investigation would begin soon. They had both barely slept the night before, their minds running through every possible outcome, From suspension to being fired. Anxiety and fear weighed heavily on them. The fire chief called Mark and Tony into his office first thing in the morning. The office was small, neat, and serious, reflecting the chief's personality. He motioned for them to sit, his face stern but calm. He began by outlining the procedure for the investigation. "We have received statements, reviewed videos, and spoken to witnesses," he said. "This is a serious matter. You have humiliated a public figure, and that reflects on the entire department. You will both be asked to provide your own statements and explain your actions." Mark and Tony looked at each other nervously. Both understood that this was no longer a casual conversation. They were now facing official scrutiny that could determine their future. The chief continued, emphasizing the importance of honesty. "I need the truth. Do not try to make excuses. What you say now will be considered in deciding the outcome. Remember that the city is watching, the mayor is watching, and your colleagues are watching." His words left little room for misjudgment or impulsive explanations. Mark and Tony swallowed hard, realizing that this moment was critical. The questioning began formally that same morning. A city investigator arrived at the station, accompanied by 2 aides from the mayor's office. Mark went first. He was asked to describe, step by step, what had happened during the visit. He hesitated at first, trying to find the right words. I mean, Tony and I were joking," he began cautiously. "We didn't mean to, we didn't think it would go this far." The investigator interrupted gently but firmly. "Did you deliberately spray water on the mayor's wife?" Mark's throat tightened, and he could feel sweat forming on his forehead. "Yes, we did. But it was a joke. We didn't mean to humiliate her." The investigator wrote notes quietly, occasionally glancing at video footage on a laptop. The footage confirmed Mark's statement but also revealed how deliberate the act had been. Every movement, every laugh, and the way they aimed the hose showed that this was no accident. The investigator did not respond immediately but instead asked a series of follow-up questions, probing for context. "Why did you think this would be acceptable? Were you concerned about the consequences? Did anyone encourage you to act this way?" Mark struggled to answer. He wanted to explain that it was meant as humor, but he also knew that humor does not excuse humiliation. Every word he said seemed to make the situation feel heavier. After Mark, Tony was questioned. His version of events was similar, though he added some details that highlighted their impulsive mindset. He admitted that they had been nervous about the visit, that they had joked about ways to break the tension, and that the hose idea had seemed funny at the time. But when the investigator showed him the video footage, even Tony realized how serious it looked. The laughter, the aiming, the spraying, it all demonstrated poor judgment. The investigator asked if they understood the impact of their actions. Tony nodded, his voice low. "Yes, we do now. We didn't think it through, but we understand that it was wrong." While the questioning continued, the rest of the firefighters watched from nearby, aware that their colleagues' careers could be in jeopardy. Some felt sympathy, recalling moments when Mark and Tony had been helpful or brave during emergencies. Others felt anger or disappointment, thinking about how reckless behavior could ruin the reputation of the entire department. Conversations became hushed, and even the usually lively station seemed heavy with tension. Everyone realized that this was a lesson in accountability, professionalism, and the weight of public trust. Once the interviews concluded, the investigator gathered the chief and a few senior officials to review the findings. They discussed the video, the witness statements, and the statements from Mark and Tony. The conclusion was clear: while there was no evidence of malicious intent beyond the act itself, the behavior was intentional, disrespectful, and completely inappropriate. There was consensus that serious disciplinary action would be necessary. Suspension, retraining, or termination were all on the table. It was also noted that public opinion and the mayor's reaction would influence the final decision. In the meantime, Mark and Tony were told to remain at the station but to continue their duties without interacting with the mayor's office. They were given additional guidance on professional conduct, emphasizing respect, teamwork, and responsibility. As they returned to their tasks, the reality began to sink in. Their friends and colleagues had begun to look at them differently. Even small gestures, like nods or smiles, were now weighed with caution. Every step they took in the station reminded them of the incident, and the fear of what was to come made even routine work stressful. The city administration also began to take measures. Public statements were prepared to assure citizens that the matter was being addressed seriously. Officials emphasized that disrespect toward public figures or any member of the city was unacceptable. Media inquiries increased, with reporters seeking updates and asking whether Mark and Tony would face consequences. Even social media continued to buzz, with videos of the incident being shared widely and analyzed in detail. Every online post, every news story, amplified the pressure. Mark and Tony could no longer escape the visibility of their actions. During the next few days, the fire chief held additional meetings with other firefighters. He emphasized the importance of learning from mistakes, maintaining discipline, and understanding the influence of actions on public perception. Workshops on professional conduct and public interaction were organized, reinforcing that every member of the department represented not only themselves but the entire city. Mark and Tony attended quietly, realizing that the environment they had once taken for granted had changed. The lessons were not theoretical, they were personal, immediate, and unavoidable. As the investigation progressed, the city administration scheduled a meeting with Mark and Tony to discuss the consequences directly. The mayor's aides were present, along with the chief and the investigator. The room was formal and tense. Evelyn, though composed, was present to observe. Both Mark and Tony could feel the weight of her presence, a silent reminder of the humiliation they had caused. The conversation began carefully. The mayor's representatives reviewed the facts, asked questions, and listened to apologies. Mark and Tony admitted their mistake, expressed regret, and promised it would never happen again. They tried to show sincerity, but they could tell that apologies alone would not erase the incident. After the meeting, Mark and Tony were left to reflect on their situation. The evidence was undeniable, the witnesses' statements were clear, and the public scrutiny was intense. They were facing the possibility of losing their jobs, something neither had ever imagined. The fear was compounded by embarrassment, regret, and a growing understanding of the seriousness of their actions. Even small interactions walking down the hall, talking to colleagues reminded them that they were under a microscope. Every step, every gesture was observed, and every decision had consequences. By the end of the week, the outcome became clearer. The mayor's office, after reviewing the investigation and consulting with the fire chief, made a formal decision: Mark and Tony would be dismissed from their positions. The decision was firm, reflecting the seriousness of the act and the need to maintain public trust. Both firefighters were called to the station for an official termination meeting. As they walked into the office, the gravity of the moment hit them fully. There was no room for excuses, no chance to appeal based on intent or humor. The decision had been made, and their careers as firefighters had come to an abrupt end. The announcement was made respectfully but firmly. Mark and Tony were asked to return their uniforms, collect personal belongings, and leave the station. The chief reminded them that they had once been valued members of the team, and that their bravery in emergencies was not forgotten, but professionalism and respect for the public were non-negotiable. As they left the firehouse for the last time, both men felt a mix of shame, sadness, and disbelief. They had lost not just their jobs, but also a part of their identity and pride. The laughter, camaraderie, and daily routine that had defined their lives were now memories, overshadowed by a moment of impulsive behavior. Outside the station, the public continued to react. Newspapers reported the dismissals, social media discussions analyzed the events, and city officials emphasized that the decision was necessary to uphold standards. Mark and Tony faced difficult conversations with friends and family, explaining how a single impulsive act could change everything. They understood now that professional conduct, respect, and accountability were not optional, they were essential. The lessons were hard, but they were clear. After leaving the firehouse for the last time, Mark and Tony walked down the quiet street, carrying nothing but the few personal items they had gathered from their lockers. The early morning sun reflected off the pavement, but it offered no warmth. Everything felt cold, heavy, and surreal. Both men were silent for a long time, each lost in his own thoughts, replaying the events that had led them here. The laughter, the joking, the casual decision to spray water on the mayor's wife, they remembered it all, now with a sharp clarity that brought shame and regret. Mark's mind kept circling back to that moment. He remembered how the hose had slipped in his hands and the water had splashed in unexpected directions. At the time, he had laughed, thinking it was harmless fun. But now, he understood how wrong that laughter had been. It had not been fun for anyone else. He could see the expression on the mayor's wife's face in his memory: surprise, embarrassment, and perhaps even fear. That image haunted him. Mark realized that the consequences of a single careless decision could be far-reaching, touching people he did not even know personally. Tony felt a similar weight pressing down on him. He had always considered himself a good firefighter, someone who helped people in emergencies without hesitation. But now, he felt that the respect and trust he had worked so hard to earn had been destroyed in an instant. He thought about the other firefighters, colleagues he had trained with and trusted for years. How would they see him now? Would they remember the brave rescues and the long nights of duty, or only this single moment of foolishness? Tony struggled to answer his own questions, knowing that public opinion often forgets the good and focuses on mistakes. Both men arrived at their separate homes in the early afternoon. Mark walked into his small apartment and sat down heavily on the couch. The room was quiet, empty, and unfamiliar in a way he hadn't noticed before. He took off his shoes, ran his hands through his hair, and stared blankly at the floor. His phone vibrated repeatedly, with messages from friends, family, and colleagues. Some were supportive, offering words of encouragement. Others were blunt, expressing disappointment or frustration. Mark felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt as he read each one. He wanted to respond, to explain himself, but he knew that no explanation could truly undo what had happened. Tony, meanwhile, sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the ceiling. The walls of his room seemed smaller now, as if they were closing in around him. He thought about his parents, who had always been proud of him and his career. How would they react to the news? How would his younger siblings view him now? The weight of their potential disappointment felt heavier than anything he had carried in his life. Tony also thought about the firefighters he had mentored, the people who had looked up to him. He realized that respect, once lost, could not be easily regained. The realization stung more than the loss of his job itself. In the days that followed, both men tried to return to some form of routine. They applied for unemployment benefits, spoke with career counselors, and updated their resumes. But every action reminded them that their previous identity as firefighters was gone. Calls from journalists and social media messages made it impossible to move forward without facing their past. They had become, in a way, public figures in a story of embarrassment and discipline. Every mention of their names online, every shared video of the incident, was a reminder that a moment of carelessness could overshadow years of hard work. The community's reaction added another layer of complexity. Some citizens were furious, believing that the firefighters had shown blatant disrespect for a public official and the city itself. They expressed their anger through letters, emails, and social media posts. Others were more understanding, emphasizing that Mark and Tony had made a mistake, not committed a crime. Community forums became spaces of debate, reflecting differing opinions about accountability, forgiveness, and professional standards. For Mark and Tony, reading these reactions was both painful and enlightening. They realized that actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined, affecting not only themselves but also public trust. Despite the public attention, both men knew that personal growth was necessary. They began attending workshops on professional behavior, conflict resolution, and public responsibility. The sessions were designed not as punishment, but as guidance for anyone seeking to rebuild trust and understand the impact of their actions. Mark found the workshops challenging, as he had never thought deeply about how impulsive humor could hurt others. Tony, too, felt humbled. He realized that leadership was not just about being brave in emergencies, but also about showing respect, maintaining composure, and considering the feelings of everyone around him. Mark and Tony also began to reconnect with friends and family, though these conversations were difficult. Friends asked tough questions, challenging them to reflect honestly on their decisions. Family members offered both criticism and support, insisting that mistakes did not define a person entirely, but that accountability was essential. Through these conversations, both men began to understand that moving forward would require more than apologies. It would require real change, self-reflection, and consistent effort. They had to rebuild not only their professional reputations but also their personal integrity. Meanwhile, the mayor and city officials continued to address the incident publicly. Statements were issued to reassure citizens that professional standards were upheld and that the dismissal of the firefighters was necessary to maintain public trust. The mayor's wife also made a brief statement, emphasizing that while the incident had been upsetting, she believed in the importance of accountability and learning from mistakes. This measured response helped calm some of the public outrage, showing that consequences could be serious without needing to escalate personal conflict. For Mark and Tony, hearing this brought a mixture of relief and regret. They were relieved that the matter was being handled professionally, yet regretful that their actions had caused distress. Over the next few weeks, both men began small steps toward rebuilding their lives. Mark started volunteering at a local community center, helping with safety demonstrations and fire prevention workshops. The work reminded him of the core reasons he had become a firefighter: to serve and protect the community. While he could no longer fight fires professionally, he found satisfaction in educating others and helping them avoid dangerous situations. Tony, meanwhile, took a similar path, joining a nonprofit organization focused on emergency preparedness. Both men realized that even though their careers had changed dramatically, their skills, knowledge, and dedication could still make a positive impact. Through these experiences, Mark and Tony also began to reflect on personal growth. They kept journals, documenting their feelings, their mistakes, and the lessons they were learning. Writing became a form of therapy, allowing them to process emotions that had felt overwhelming. They reflected on how pride, humor, and impulsive behavior had led to consequences they had never imagined. They also wrote about the importance of empathy, respect, and accountability not just in professional life, but in everyday interactions. Each entry helped them understand that rebuilding trust required time, honesty, and consistent actions. Socially, life was changing as well. Colleagues from the firehouse reached out cautiously, some offering support, others avoiding contact. Community members noticed their volunteer work and began to recognize efforts to contribute positively. Slowly, the perception of Mark and Tony began to shift, not entirely, but enough to show that redemption was possible. They learned that rebuilding a reputation was not about erasing past mistakes but demonstrating a commitment to improvement. Every small act of responsibility became a building block in regaining trust. By the end of the month, both men had begun to accept the reality of their situation. Their careers as firefighters were over, but their lives were not. They had faced public embarrassment, personal disappointment, and professional loss. Yet, through reflection, support, and new opportunities, they began to see a path forward. Mistakes had defined a moment, but they did not have to define the entirety of their lives. Mark and Tony realized that accountability, humility, and dedication could transform even a painful experience into a powerful lesson. Even in their darkest moments, there was a sense of resilience. Both men understood that life was unpredictable, that mistakes could happen, and that the consequences could be severe. But they also recognized that growth was possible, that second chances could be earned through action, and that personal integrity could be rebuilt over time. The incident would remain a part of their story, a reminder of the importance of thinking before acting, but it did not have to be the end. It could be the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by a single mistake, but by the choices they made afterward. Months had passed since the incident that had changed Mark and Tony's lives forever. The initial shock, anger, and embarrassment had slowly given way to reflection, personal growth, and a cautious hope for the future. While neither man could return to the firehouse as a professional firefighter, they both discovered new ways to use their skills, experiences, and knowledge to serve their community. Life, they realized, was not only about facing consequences, it was about learning from them and moving forward with purpose. Mark had spent the last several months volunteering at the community center, teaching children and adults about fire safety and emergency preparedness. Each day, he spoke with groups of school children, showing them how to stay safe in case of a fire, how to call for help, and what to do if someone is in danger. At first, he felt nervous, thinking the students might see him as the man who had made a foolish mistake. But over time, he noticed the curiosity and respect in their eyes. They listened attentively, asked questions, and even shared stories about fire drills at home. The work gave Mark a sense of satisfaction he hadn't realized he missed. He was no longer responding to emergencies with adrenaline and sirens, but he was preventing emergencies, and that felt just as important. Tony, on the other hand, found his path in a nonprofit organization that focused on community preparedness and safety education. He organized workshops for neighborhoods, teaching families how to create safety plans, how to use fire extinguishers, and how to stay calm in emergencies. Tony discovered that his calm demeanor, leadership skills, and ability to explain complex safety procedures in simple ways made him highly effective. While he had been stripped of his professional title, he realized that his knowledge and dedication could still make a meaningful difference in people's lives. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that true service was not confined to a uniform or a rank, it was about helping others in any capacity possible. Both men continued to process the emotional and social consequences of the incident. They attended counseling sessions to better understand their actions, the impact on the mayor's wife, and the broader community. These sessions were often challenging. Mark struggled with feelings of shame and guilt, replaying the moment over and over in his mind, wishing he could go back and act differently. Tony worked to rebuild his self-confidence, reminding himself that while mistakes could be costly, they did not erase a lifetime of dedication, hard work, and good intentions. Through counseling, both men learned to forgive themselves, accept their mistakes, and focus on actions they could take to make amends. Community response evolved as well. Initially, the story of the water spraying incident had dominated local news, social media, and casual conversations. Citizens were upset, disappointed, and many criticized the lack of professionalism. However, as Mark and Tony became involved in volunteer work and educational initiatives, the narrative began to shift. Articles and posts began highlighting their efforts to give back, their dedication to public safety, and their genuine remorse for past mistakes. People began to see them not just as the firefighters who made a careless decision, but as individuals committed to learning from it and contributing positively. The shift was gradual, but it showed that accountability paired with action could rebuild trust over time. Mark and Tony also learned valuable lessons about humility, responsibility, and communication. They realized that even moments of humor, if not thought through carefully, could have far-reaching effects. They understood that public roles, especially ones like firefighting, come with a level of trust that cannot be taken lightly. Mark often reflected on how his laughter at the moment of the incident had seemed harmless, but had caused real distress to someone else. Tony thought about how he had underestimated the importance of thinking before acting, even when surrounded by friends and colleagues. Both men internalized these lessons, vowing to carry them forward in every aspect of their lives. Friendships and personal relationships deepened during this period of reflection. Friends who had initially distanced themselves reached out with empathy and understanding. Family members offered support, encouragement, and reminders that mistakes do not define a person's worth. Mark and Tony grew closer to the people who believed in them, learning the importance of surrounding themselves with those who offered constructive guidance rather than judgment alone. They discovered that relationships could be strengthened through honesty, accountability, and consistent effort to do better. As time went on, opportunities began to emerge for Mark and Tony to build new careers. Mark was offered a part-time position at a fire prevention company, where he could design educational materials, run safety campaigns, and conduct community workshops. Tony received an offer to lead a local emergency preparedness initiative, coordinating volunteers and organizing public safety events. Both men realized that while their previous careers as professional firefighters were over, new paths had opened that still allowed them to contribute meaningfully. These opportunities were not replacements, they were evolutions of their dedication to public service. Public speaking became a central part of their new roles. Mark and Tony were invited to schools, community centers, and local events to share their experiences, not only to teach fire safety but also to discuss the importance of accountability and learning from mistakes. They spoke candidly about the incident, acknowledging their actions, expressing sincere regret, and emphasizing the lessons they had learned. Their honesty and willingness to accept responsibility resonated with audiences. People were drawn to their authenticity and appreciated the message that mistakes, while serious, could be transformed into opportunities for growth. One of the most meaningful experiences for both men came when they were asked to meet the mayor's wife to apologize in person. The meeting was tense at first, filled with nervous anticipation. Mark and Tony expressed their sincere apologies, explaining that they had reflected deeply on their actions and understood the hurt and embarrassment they had caused. The mayor's wife listened carefully, acknowledging their remorse and the steps they had taken to contribute positively to the community. She did not offer an easy forgiveness, but she recognized their efforts and sincerity. For both men, the meeting provided closure, an opportunity to face the consequences head-on and demonstrate that they were committed to change. Mark and Tony also began mentoring younger volunteers, teaching them not only about fire safety and emergency preparedness but also about ethics, professionalism, and the impact of personal choices. They shared their story as a cautionary tale, emphasizing that even small, seemingly harmless decisions could have serious consequences. Their experiences became valuable lessons for others, helping to prevent similar mistakes and encouraging accountability in the next generation. Through mentoring, both men found a sense of fulfillment, realizing that their past mistakes had created an opportunity to teach and guide others in meaningful ways. By the end of the year, both men had settled into their new routines. The embarrassment and public scrutiny had faded, replaced by respect for their dedication, honesty, and resilience. They had rebuilt not only their professional identities but also their personal integrity, learning that mistakes could lead to growth if approached with humility, reflection, and action. Mark often reflected on how far he had come, from a moment of careless humor to becoming a trusted educator and mentor. Tony recognized that while the incident had been painful, it had also provided an opportunity to redirect his skills and energy toward meaningful work in the community. The incident remained a part of their lives, a memory that occasionally resurfaced in conversations, articles, or public discussions. But it no longer defined them. Instead, it became a reference point for personal growth, a reminder of the importance of responsibility, respect, and mindfulness. Mark and Tony learned that life was unpredictable, and that even well-intentioned actions could lead to serious consequences. They also learned that facing those consequences with honesty and effort could transform challenges into opportunities for redemption and positive impact. In their final reflection, Mark and Tony realized that they had gained more than they had lost. They had learned humility, accountability, and resilience. They had discovered new ways to serve their community and found fulfillment in roles that allowed them to educate, mentor, and guide others. Their journey showed that even in the face of public embarrassment and professional loss, it was possible to rebuild trust, find purpose, and contribute meaningfully to society. Mistakes, they understood, were not the end, they were lessons waiting to be learned. As the story concluded, both men stood as examples of human resilience. They demonstrated that even serious errors could be transformed into opportunities for growth, service, and leadership. Mark and Tony had faced the consequences of their actions, learned from their mistakes, and taken deliberate steps to improve themselves and their communities. Their journey was a reminder that life was not defined by a single moment, but by the choices made afterward. In the end, they emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed to the values that had originally led them to become firefighters: courage, service, and dedication to the well-being of others.